Hey everyone, Dennis Chang here. Today's video is for beginners and maybe even jazz guitar teachers. And I want to present to you an alternative approach to learning jazz guitar than what seems to be the mainstream education nowadays. We're going to be looking at one of the most popular jazz standards called Blue Bossa. And in my opinion, it's one of the best tunes for jazz beginners to learn. If you watch my other videos, you know that I talk a lot, and it's because these lessons are for those who really want to get good and to really understand the music. Before we start, there's the usual thing, the usual pitch. Please like and subscribe. It makes such a huge difference. Share, comment, and this high quality content is 100% for free, and it takes quite a lot of effort to make. Liking and commenting makes such a huge difference in the YouTube algorithm. Believe it or not, I actually make some money from this. Thank you so much. And if you actually want to contribute financially, well then please consider checking out my DC Music School or my SoundSlice page, where I have a number of lessons that I am particularly proud of. And some of these courses on SoundSlice are very relevant to today's video. For example, the Bebop licks course, as well as the harmony course, and even the phrasing course. They're all on SoundSlice. You'll find all the relevant links in the description box. Okay, let's get started. So this video is dedicated to a young fellow that I met recently here in Taiwan, who had never played jazz before and who came to a jam session that I hosted last week, a week ago. And he had never played jazz before, really, and I encouraged him to try Blue Bossa, which he had never played. At that moment, a week ago, he did what he could. You know, I told him, all right, C minor scale and D flat major scale, and hope for the best. And then a few days later, so that was on Sunday, a few days later I played at a jazz club on a Wednesday night. So yeah, 3 days later, he actually came to listen to me play. I really appreciated that he came to check out live music, because for me this is incredibly important, because this is actually how I learned to play music. In the beginning I started with the Django style, or what people call gypsy jazz. And in those days I remember I spent an entire summer going to check out the one and only band playing that style of music at the time. It was every Sunday. So for an entire summer, I think I went to every single gig they had, which was like a weekly thing at a cafe on a Sunday afternoon. That was my education at the time, and it was a very important part of my education. So that made me really happy that he came to check some live music out. And during the second set, I encouraged him to grab my guitar and try to play Blue Bossa. And to my very, very pleasant surprise, it turned out that he actually went and learned the song. And he actually practiced the song. Right, he only had 3 days to do it, and he didn't expect to be going on stage on a Wednesday night with professional musicians. He played with the band that I was playing, and I think he did a really, really good job. That really made my day, and I dedicate this video to him. So that's the right attitude, and I hope you get something out of this. Let me start by talking about mainstream jazz education. What is that? I guess different people will have different answers, but personally I lurk around the internet. I'm that creepy guy. And I read and even listen to what jazz educators are often teaching nowadays. And I see and hear a lot of things that I just can't really agree with. The information itself isn't necessarily wrong, but in my opinion, it isn't ideal, especially for beginners. Nowadays, everything has been decoded and analyzed. And through the power of a language, we have invented terms that weren't used in those days to describe certain things. So these terms themselves are not necessarily wrong, but psychologically, it gives the impression that some things are way more complicated than they necessarily are. And my basic philosophy is to make things as simple as possible. Now, if something has to be complicated, and the explanation itself has to be of a certain complexity, then so be it. Let me give you an example of what I mean though. If I ask, what does hunger mean? Let's say I'm learning the English language. What does hunger mean? I think most people would agree that one of the most simple explanations would be that hunger is the feeling that you get when you want to eat something. Boom, direct, right? In the mainstream jazz education, however, many jazz teachers might say something like the following. I'm going to read this from Wikipedia. They will tell you that hunger is the physical sensation related to contractions of the stomach muscle. These contractions are triggered by high concentrations of the ghrelin hormone. Now, there's certainly a place for this kind of talk, but for beginners, why not just use my definition? That scientific definition isn't wrong in itself, but sometimes I even see really bad information. Beginners don't know any better because they don't know anything. And you have these people with good intentions, but probably with a serious case of Dunning-Kruger, talking about things they have no business talking about, and at worst, giving false information. Well, then what makes me different? Well, I start every one of my videos with a sample of my playing. And if you like what you hear, then stay a while and listen. But also, I spent most of my career working with some of the biggest names in jazz music, producing lessons for my DC music school, for instance. And on top of that, in my own free time, I research a lot of music history stuff. I've investigated or transcribed well over 1,000 jazz solos, not just guitar, trumpet, violin, saxophone, piano. I put so much thought into the psychology of education. If, on the other hand, you think my playing is bad, then fair enough. Hopefully you can go find information elsewhere. Furthermore, I rarely make bold statements. A lot of people misunderstand me often, but I'm usually fairly clear with what I say. But I will basically be presenting you with various possibilities to approach blue bossa from the perspective of a beginner. From the perspective of a beginner. This is a very important part of my previous sentence, because one thing that I encounter a lot in education in general, not just jazz education, but the teachers nowadays often have no idea what it's like to be a beginner. And not only do they overcomplicate things, they don't know how to work with the psychological state of a beginner. So in jazz music, what often happens, what I've often witnessed, is that these teachers will make the students learn songs that, in my opinion, they shouldn't be working on yet, at least as far as learning improvisation. And blue bossa is, in my opinion, one of the ideal songs for beginners to learn, especially when you want to learn to play over changes. Now, there are so many approaches out there, and I can't say that this one is necessarily better than another. It really depends on what works for you and what you like. Furthermore, there are different styles of jazz out there. And here we're mainly working within the context of what many people would call mainstream jazz or bebop jazz guitar. And different styles sometimes have different traditions or approaches. So I'm basically going to be working within the bebop language, because it's one of the styles that I've investigated. All right, let's dive into the tune. So the first thing to do as a jazz guitarist, in my opinion, would be to learn the chords to the tune. The only thing odd about learning this tune from a beginner's perspective is that it's a bossa. Normally when we're learning jazz, we tend to start with swing tunes because that tends to be the most common style. And while blue bossa can be played as a swing, here we'll stick to how it's originally played. Truth be told, I'm not an expert in bossa music, but here's a basic groove that a jazz guitarist, a beginner anyway, could start with. Let's take a simple chord shape like this C minor 7 that hopefully you know. And we're going to play this groove. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there can be tiny variations here and there. I often do this by feel now. Obviously I'm talking into a camera here, and I personally don't know how many chord voicings you know. Obviously the more you know, the more options you have. But let's just say you're a relative beginner, you know a few basic chords. Let's use those, and let's go through a round of blue bossa. Keep in mind, I'll try to maintain the groove that I showed you as much as possible, but often I'm playing by instinct because I have many years of experience. I may change the groove here and there. We'll see what happens. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. There, that's the top of the form. Now let's say you're a little bit more advanced, maybe you know a few more fancier chords. Here is, in my opinion, a slightly more musical way of playing the song. And for good measure, here's a third version. Let's do basic chords again, but in different positions. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Personally, I don't really like this version. I feel it's a little bit too high for my taste, but it's a possibility. Now remember, depending on your level, I would suggest that you stick to one option before trying to learn everything, especially if all this is foreign to you. And that goes for everything I will show you in this video. Basically, this video will be many lessons in one single video. So you should basically go at a pace that you can handle. Another very fun thing you can do is work out some kind of a bass line, especially to train your ears to hear the bass. This is a jazz style bossa line, because I think real bossa players have another way of playing. But in the jazz style, jazz musicians would usually accept this. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. I kept it relatively basic, but I added some little passing melodies here and there. Then you can mix the two together. This is something that I would do if I were one of the main accompanists. Let's say there's no bass player and it's just the guitar doing the accompaniment. I tend to favor this style more. If there were a bass player, I would just do a simple groove. But here's a mix of the two. 1, 2, 3, 4. So because I'm playing two parts at the same time, the bass is slightly different. It's not like this, but with more. Which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is closer to the way real bossa players might play. I could be wrong, I'm not an expert. At any rate, that's also something that you can do. So one thing to be very aware of as a beginner is that when you're advanced, you vary the way you play according to the situation, according to the orchestration, according to the people that you play with, etc. Again, since you're a beginner, I would just suggest sticking to what you can do. But just keep in mind of the open possibilities when it comes to playing jazz music. One very important thing is I also suggest that you go on the internet to check out different versions of this tune by good players. Like Pat Martino kind of plays it as a samba. The original version is also quite interesting with Joe Henderson. I think that's the original version. And it has a special bass line that has nothing to do with what I showed you here. And there's a cool version of Joe Pass with the vibe player Milt Jackson on vibes. So it doesn't have to be a guitarist as well. There's a really nice version by Dexter Gordon. So just go on the internet and see what's out there. And one very important thing that I suggest you do is to develop your ears and even your body to follow the rhythm section. So when you're listening to these players play, try to follow with your ears and your body, feel the groove. If it's too fast, maybe slow it down, and then grab your guitar and play along, just play these rhythms. That's something I used to do a lot when I first started out. That was a huge thing for me because I wasn't very confident with soloing. I didn't even know how to start, and I spent quite a lot of time, quite a few months, mainly playing chords and along to recordings, and that really developed my ears, my sense of harmony, and I tried different chords in different positions. And when that ultimately proved to be very useful for soloing eventually. Because what is very important is that you have to train your ears and your body to especially recognize where you are in the song at all times. After doing this for a while, you can maybe go to a random part of the song and see how fast it takes for you to recognize where you are. Because often what happens in live situations, sometimes the rhythm section, the musicians that you play with make mistakes. They go to another section. Well, blue bossa, usually people don't make mistakes because it's such a short form, but there are other songs that are more complicated where sometimes a musician might skip a section and go to this other section. And you have to have the ears to recognize, oops, that's what they did, let me follow. If you're starting out and you need a chart, go ahead and use it. But the goal would be to eventually have it memorized so you can focus on the more musical aspect of things. Really, I can't stress the importance of this rhythm guitar thing, at least for me. Like, it developed my ears to hear and understand harmony at a subconscious level. The next thing that I would suggest that you do is get a loop pedal to record yourself playing a few rounds, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, of rhythm guitar. And the loop pedal is a great tool to see how stable your time feel is, because if your time feel is not stable, the loop will be messed up. Now, I don't own a loop pedal because I don't know if that technology existed when I was a beginner, but it's a really good tool nowadays. The next best thing would be to get just a basic recording setup, and nowadays it's very easy to do this. And for beginners, I highly recommend this, again, for developing your time feel, because that's something that many beginners and even professionals, myself included, struggle with, time feel. I would even suggest that you do this every time you're working on this tune. So basically record yourself playing the rhythm guitar part, and then, practice your improvisation over it. And then the next day when you work on this song again, do it from scratch. Repeat the process so that you can really train the physical connection to the rhythm. And of course, there are lots of pre-made backing tracks that you can use as well. But those other methods are something that I think are really beneficial. Once you get the chords sorted out and can play the song without having to think about it too much, then we can get started with the fun stuff. I would, of course, recommend that you learn the melody, which I won't be teaching you due to copyright reasons. I don't want this video to get demonetized. And I'm already even afraid of mentioning the song title because it's not illegal at all, but YouTube has an automatic filter that sometimes, even though I'm not breaking a rule, it catches some things and the video gets demonetized for quite a while. And so basically your comments and your likes make a huge difference, so be sure to do that. Or buy my lessons on SoundSlice or DC Music School. Okay, I know many of you are dying to learn how to solo. This is where it gets complicated because there are so many approaches. I'm going to go through a number of them in no particular order. How you choose to approach this is entirely up to you. And I basically suggest you do what's most enjoyable. Each have their own pros and cons. And eventually what could be really cool is to do some kind of mix. Again, all of this is from a beginner's perspective. So from a beginner's perspective, the easiest, well, I don't know if it's easy, but one of the easiest approaches would be the very basic scales approach or key center approach. I want to share a story with you here about how people overcomplicate things. So one time I went to a jazz camp to see how things were being taught. And I saw a kid struggling over this very song. He might have spent 5-10 minutes really struggling his way over the first few bars of it, on the first 3 chords even. So I asked him what his approach was, and he showed me what his teachers had showed him. Basically, first chord, C minor, Aeolian, F minor, Dorian, D half diminished, Locrian, G7, G Mixolydian, flat 9, flat 13, etc. All these modes and everything. He was basically trying to wrap his brain around this. Like each chord is like, all right, C Aeolian. Okay, then F Dorian. What's F Dorian? It's like etc. And he just couldn't get through the first few measures. This is what I mean when people overcomplicate things. So this chord scale approach certainly has its place in certain contexts, but in this particular context, I think it's overkill and completely unnecessary. As far as Blue Bossa is concerned, as far as this song is concerned, the only two things to know are that it's in C minor, and then the B part goes to D flat major, and then comes back to C minor. That's it. And in the C minor part, if we were to use a scale approach, just like a C minor is good enough for the most part. And when I showed that little kid that concept, he was flying over the song. It wasn't the best solo, but at least he was no longer stumbling, because all he had to know was the key of C minor and then the key of D flat. Boom. Problem solved for now. Okay, so you can use that C minor basic scale, but on the G7 chord, it might be a good idea to make a little modification. Is instead of playing a B flat, change it to a B natural, so that it has that note which is in G7. Keep in mind that Miles Davis, even over a G7 chord, has sometimes played notes from the wrong scale, the regular C minor. You can hear that actually in his version of Autumn Leaves. But to break rules requires a certain level of musical maturity, which a beginner is not likely to have. In the D flat section, well, D flat major is the only scale you need to know. Now here are the important details about this approach. If you're a beginner, it is highly likely that you don't hear the jazz language in your head. So you're just basically fumbling through the notes of the scale and using your ears and instincts to guide you. You're basically kind of faking it. Seasoned jazz musicians will be able to hear this right away, but it's okay. Baby steps. This approach allows you to solo correctly over the song, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll sound good, and you're very unlikely to be playing in the style, whether you even want to be playing in the style or not. However, the important thing about this approach is that you know where you are at all times. So play in such a way that you can keep track of where you are in the song. That usually means not playing too much or all the time, because sometimes that's what beginners do. They play too many notes, they're like non-stop playing, and then they lose track of where they are. Let's say over the C minor chord, just play a few notes and then wait, so you can keep track of what the rhythm section is doing, like feel the rhythm or somehow count in your subconscious. Then F minor comes. Okay, then continue your whatever scale you were playing, that scale, but continue your idea. Wait a little bit, and then okay, then what's the next chord? Be able to anticipate when the next chord is going to change. So play simple if you have to do that to be able to keep track of where you are. It is non-negotiable. You need to know where you are at all times. This is particularly important in the C minor section, because when we reach the G7, that's where you'll want to be able to get ready to change this note to this one in that scale. This is a scale that we call C harmonic minor, in case you wanted to know and you didn't know. But since we're emphasizing it over a G7 chord, it is a scale that some teachers call G Mixolydian flat 9 flat 13, or some heavy metal players will call it Phrygian dominant. Personally, I don't really care about the name. It's the sound that matters. If you can hear the sound and you can use it, that's what matters to me. And this is one of the important lessons of jazz harmony. Is when you encounter this progression, D minor 7 flat 5 to G7 and to C minor. This is what we call a 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C minor. 2-5, if you write it down, 2-5-1, you write them as Roman numerals. And these numbers, Roman numerals, refer to the bass motion based on the scale degree. So 2, second degree of C minor, 5, fifth degree of C minor, 1, 2, 5, 1. And it's these chords in minor. D minor 7 flat 5 to G7 to C minor. That is a 2-5-1. You're going to be hearing a lot of this in your jazz journey. There are actually some really good jazz musicians who don't know what a 2-5-1 is. Because like I said, the name itself is not necessarily important. It's very useful to know, but it's not like critical. There's some people who only focus on the ear aspect, which we're going to talk later. And as long as you got the ears going on, that's what matters. Now, within the 2-5-1, the important thing I want you to know is that the 2 and 5 are actually serving the same purpose. That is that they lead to the one chord. They resolve to the one chord. And they are the same function, but some players also treat them as the same chord. And, well, if you want to know why that is, you have to check out my harmony course on SoundSlice. But basically, they're two sides of the same coin. For now, just believe me. Why is this useful to know? Because if we use the scales approach, for instance, we are left with two possibilities. So, over the D minor 7 flat 5 chord, we could theoretically continue to use the C minor scale, or we could switch to this special harmonic minor scale right when we reach D minor 7 flat 5. And if you do this, it kind of tells people that you are treating this D minor 7 flat 5 and the G7 as one unit, as a family. And that's what it is. Both are possible. It's a matter of preference and interpretation. So being able to keep track of where you are is what allows you to be able to switch at the right moment. And then we suddenly switch to the key of D flat. So that's another reason why you have to know where you are at all times. And when you get to D flat, well, just work on your D flat major shapes, and there we go. Here we have another 2-5-1, but this time it's in a major key. So E flat minor, A flat 7, and D flat. In a major key, we don't have to modify any scale to do our basic scale approach. So basically the whole D flat major scale works over the 2-5-1 progression in the key of D flat. But again, the 2 and the 5 can be treated as the same function, which is the case, and they can be treated the same way, which is not relevant right now, but will be relevant when we look at different approaches later. For now, just use your ears. Remember, when you play a scale, you don't have to start from the root all the time. Like let's say over the C minor, you can start from this note. And then you can skip notes. You can, well, we're going to get to arpeggios, but if you know a few arpeggios, then you can start. Right? So this is a quick way to get you started with the improvisation and just having fun. As long as you keep track of where you are at all times, then it's a relatively easy approach. And the main disadvantage, in my opinion, of this approach is if you're a beginner, since you're a beginner, you still don't have any vocabulary and are just experimenting with the scale. It teaches you nothing about language. Again, if you even want to learn the Bebop language or whatever other language. This Bebop language goes far beyond this approach, so be very aware of this. Let's listen to one chorus of what the scales approach would sound like. For me, it's actually very difficult to strictly use this approach because I tend to play what I hear in my head. And I can hear many things in my head because I have so much experience learning the Bebop language. And like I said, the Bebop language goes far beyond this approach. But anyway, let's give it a try. I'll do my best. Okay, now with this scales thing, I would suggest that you start with one area of the fretboard rather than trying to learn the positions everywhere. For example, a C minor, you can learn it right here. And then even go further down just to get a few more extra notes. Boom. Then D flat. Right? And even if that's too much, then just do like maybe the top 4 strings. flat major scale. Like just limit your range so that you don't have to think about too many notes. Well, again, I'm just offering suggestions, not something you have to do, but basically make it so that it's accessible to you relatively quickly. Then if you get familiar with this position, you can try this position, this other position. Here's another position, C minor. I'm playing these scales relatively quickly just because hopefully you do know these scales. If not, you can just look up online C minor scale and look at different positions. Okay, then D flat. There we go. And of course, you modify the C minor so you get this that scale for the G7 chord, etc., etc. Believe it or not, a lot of the best jazz guitar players don't necessarily have every single position 100% mastered. Even myself, I know all the positions, but I'm more fluent in a few certain key areas depending on the phrase that I'm playing. So there's this myth that you have to know everything 100% well. It's worth practicing when you're more advanced, but as a beginner, you can just focus on a few basic positions. Keep in mind, again, some professionals, like even Charlie Christian, he had his favorite positions and he rarely ventured outside of them. All right, this scales approach could be quite a bit of work. I don't know how long it would take you, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months. Let me know how it works for you if you just try this approach. Okay, let's look at the next approach. We're going to use chord tones, which often translates to some kind of arpeggio study. There are quite a few possibilities here. Do we play 3-note arpeggios, 4-note arpeggios, or what? Everything is worth exploring for sure, but for the sake of simplicity and time, for this video, we're just going to do a simplification. It has no specific musical intention behind this, but all the minor chords, we're going to learn them as triads. It's just an arbitrary decision on my part, but triads are worth knowing anyway, so let's do them. Even if you add other notes, 4-note arpeggios, 5 notes, you still have to go through the triad, so it's just worth working on them. For the 4-note chords, we're going to reserve those for the dominant chords, so the G7 and the A flat 7. And one little special thing, the D minor 7 flat 5, we're going to treat it as an F minor. Why is that? You have to check out my harmony course, but within D minor 7 flat 5 is an actual F minor chord. Basically, a D minor 7 flat 5 is an F minor chord with the note D added to it. And it's also synonymous to the chord known as F minor 6. F minor 6, D minor 7 flat 5 are the same chord. The difference would be in the bass note. So let's check this out. C minor, let's do it in this position. Here's a C minor arpeggio. Then the F minor, here's an F minor arpeggio. For the D minor 7 flat 5, we use the same arpeggio. And if you're brave and you want to add the note D, then go ahead. For the G7, this is where we're going to do a 4-note arpeggio. And then back to C minor. For the B section, we're going to have an E flat minor. You can use this E flat minor right here. Then A flat 7. Then D flat major. There we go. Those are the arpeggios that you should learn. Again, the same thing with the scales. Try in one position first before you look at every different position. And if even going through all 6 strings is too difficult, just focus on top 4 strings. The cool thing with this approach is that we train our ears to hear the changes, the chord tones. And now we're definitely nailing the change because we're playing chord tones only. And just like the scales, you don't have to start from the bottom or from the top. You can start somewhere in the middle. You can skip notes. Instead of doing, you can do. Now, the disadvantage with this approach is that if you only strictly have chord tones to work with, well, it can get pretty limiting and boring quite fast. Pretty much sound like a robot playing the changes. And here is where we're going to put a little bit of artistic interpretation. Now, remember how I said the 2-5 formed one unit together? They serve as a function of instability wanting to resolve to the one chord. So in the key of C minor, the D minor 7 flat 5 and G7 are quote unquote unstable, and together they work together to resolve to C minor. In D flat, it's E flat minor to A flat 7 to D flat. In the D minor 7 flat 5 to G7 unit, I mentioned that they can be potentially treated as the same chord. And because I have experience listening to a lot of jazz, this is where I will suggest that if you want to do that, that you eliminate the D minor 7 flat 5 altogether and think G7 over that chord. So basically all you have to worry now would be about the first two chords, C minor, F minor, and then the D minor 7 flat 5 G7, just think G7. Then C minor. So that's a common thing that happens in a minor key when a 2-5-1. In a major key, it's the other way around. Jazz musicians realized that playing the 2 chord over the A flat 7, over the 5 chord, had a really nice sound to it. And even 2 minor 7 to give it a more special flavor. But maybe do it if you want, but with a triad, the reason why that works is because if you have an A flat 7 and more specifically an A flat 9 chord, which have the notes A flat, C, E flat, G flat, and B flat, well, the last 3 notes, E flat, G flat, B flat, it's an E flat minor triad. That's why it works. And one modification that I would make over the G7 chord or the D minor 7 flat 5, when I say G7 now I'm talking about D minor 7 flat 5, I treat them as the same. But what's a really cool thing you can do, let's say you start on the note G and you're going up. Play the G first, then play the arpeggio. Then when you get to the next octave, instead of playing G, play an A flat. That's something that is done by a lot of jazz musicians. Or if you start from G here and you want to go down, you can also do. Then go down. Or go to G directly here if that's their last note. Just like a little approach there. Playing this A flat basically creates what we call a G7 flat 9 arpeggio. Now let's check this out. Let me do a solo playing like robotic arpeggios. Now let's see what that sounds like. And now, let me play a solo using more artistic arpeggios. So those are two possibilities. The second one is more quote-unquote artistic, but even then, because I'm strictly limiting myself to arpeggio tones, I find it so very limiting. It sounds like an exercise and it's not music at all in my opinion, if we only use these parameters anyway. But there are ways to decorate the chord tones through what we call enclosures or approach tones. The easiest one would be the chromatic approach tone from below. So let's say C minor. Here's your arpeggio. You approach each chord tone by a chromatic step below. So that's one. And there are so many of them. If you want to learn more about this, then check out my Bebop vocabulary course on Soundslides because I go in detail about the evolution of these ornaments and how they end up being some of the bebop ornaments that we have today. So if you've worked on the arpeggios and the scales approach and maybe this basic enclosure, you can try to maybe even mix these approaches and come up with something at least a little bit more musical finally. And let's see what that would sound like. For me, it's still very limiting, but at least it opens up certain possibilities. Okay, and then there's a bonus approach I'll put in here. Especially for those of you who come from a blues background and know how have some blues vocabulary in your head, well, over the C minor section, then you can just be playing bluesy stuff. I'm not going to talk about that because that's a huge topic. And likewise, over the major part, there's a way to play bluesy over it. And the only way to do this is to listen to some blues music and see how they approach various chord progressions. For me, personally, the blues, this is another thing, the way people teach, oh yeah, if you want to learn blues, you got to learn the minor pentatonic scale and the major pentatonic scale or the blues scale. It's an oversimplification of something for me that is a little bit more mysterious. Because if we were to say that blues, oh yeah, just learn the minor pentatonic scale, well, does this sound like blues to you? Doesn't sound anything like blues, right? Sounds like me going out to the night market in Taiwan. No, for me, blues is a language. And of course, a lot of blues language could be theoretically analyzed using the pentatonic scale, but it's still more complex than that. And this leads me to the next approach, which is the language approach, which basically means go and listen to different players and try to absorb the language. If you follow my suggestion of spending a lot of time listening to recordings while playing rhythm guitar, hopefully you've gotten accustomed to hearing what the musicians are doing during the solos. There are so many ways to approach the language approach, and it depends on the artist, of course, and also what you hope to get out of them. You can literally just take entire phrase and copy and paste them, or you can go for the general idea or general sound. So for instance, if you check out the Dexter Gordon version, at one point he does this thing where he plays the note A over C minor, which is the sixth. It's a specific color that he goes for. And it's something you can latch onto whenever there's a C minor chord, for instance. If you know your basic scales and your basic arpeggios, and now you have this idea that you can play the note A with it over the C minor chord, then you can come up with your own phrase. There we go. Here's a phrase that I came up with right now based on an idea from Dexter Gordon. I mean, I knew this idea before. It's one of the most common things you can do. This language approach is basically how I learned that on a 2-5 you can just think one thing. For instance, using that C harmonic minor scale over D minor 7 flat 5 and G7, or ignoring the A flat 7 and thinking only E flat minor or even E flat minor 7. Just for fun, I took a few different ideas from a few different players, mainly licks that you can use. Here's one from Pat Martino. It's over the D minor 7 flat 5 G7, and there's an instance where he's ignoring the D minor 7 flat 5. He's just thinking G7. One more time. Here's another phrase that he does over a D minor 7 flat 5 to G7. And again, he's kind of ignoring the D minor 7 flat 5. Well, for the first few notes, you can say that he's thinking D minor 7 flat 5. I actually have no idea what he's thinking. He probably has his own system. He does have his own system. But if we analyze it using the terminology that we have today, we can just justify it as a G7 chord. And here's the phrase. Here's how it goes. So it's actually a special thing. The first part he's thinking G7. Then the second part he's doing something else altogether, because like I said, bebop language goes far beyond just like a basic scales approach. Here he's superimposing harmonies. It goes beyond the scope of this this video. But just want to say that when I first started lifting phrases from other players, I didn't always necessarily understand the theory. I just knew that it sounded good over this chord progression. So here it is again. It resolves to C minor or Pretty cool, huh? Here's one from Joe Pass, a really cool one. Again, over the D minor 7 flat 5 G7. He's thinking something quite interesting here. Well, again, I can't say with 100% certainty, but my theoretical interpretation is that he's thinking F minor major 7 over this 2-5-1 chord progression. It's another substitution that it's done. So F minor major 7 is this chord. And here's this phrase. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Really cool phrase. At the end, he does think G7, but here it's this F minor major 7 arpeggio. Here's another phrase again over the D minor 7 flat 5 G7 by Joe Pass from that same recording with Milt Jackson. So it starts on the end of 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Pretty cool phrase, huh? Here's that chromatic approach. That chromatic approach that I talked to you about. And then it's a scale. And then another enclosure. So it's built from ingredients that we covered in this video. So hopefully you get the idea of what you can do for the language perspective. And one thing that I also did a lot back in the day, using whatever limited knowledge I have, is I created my own phrases based on what I heard, as long as I understood the basic idea. So earlier there was that idea of Dexter Gordon emphasizing the note A on the C minor chord. So here's a phrase that has that concept that I made up myself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then you can see if it works over F minor, which it does. Then you find the fingering that's convenient for you. F minor. And just for fun, here are some phrases that I'll make up on the spot for you. And for me, this is very easy to do because I've been listening to this music for so long. I've immersed myself in it for so long that it just comes out fairly automatically. And even what I'm making them up, but actually they're all in this style, so it's actually nothing really original. But here's another for C minor. Let's see. And then you can transpose it to F minor. And then when you're in the key of D flat, you can just use it over the E flat minor and A flat 7. Alright, that's another one. What's another one? Well, in that Pat Martino solo, at one point, you know, he resolved that C minor with a 9th here. So let's play with that. So let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then for F minor. Try to see the chord shapes, like dun, dun. So C minor with a 9. And that's pretty cool over the E flat minor, A flat 7. Here's a phrase over D flat. Very common. Here's another one. And actually, this phrase, this is something you're going to realize when you start to explore the language approach, that sometimes phrases can be recycled and used over different chord qualities. So here we use it over D flat major. But let's use that same phrase, but over a C minor. And of course, we have to transpose accordingly. But over a C minor, it would be like this. Here's another phrase, D flat major. Let's try that over C minor. It might not always be convenient, but see if you can play them in different areas of the fingerboard, different octaves. If it works easily, then keep it. If it doesn't, then just stick to the easy ones. The bebop language can get really intricate, so you might not always understand what's going on. So the plug and play approach sometimes can be fine as it is, just to get your ears accustomed to some of these foreign sounds. So essentially, this is my guide to approaching improvisation on Blue Bossa as a beginner. As you get more advanced, you can try to figure out what's actually going on in some of the more complicated phrases. But more importantly, take what you want, take what you learned here, and try them on other songs. For instance, Autumn Leaves has a lot of similar chord progressions, and then you can just try the same ideas. And hopefully when you get more advanced, then you can start to modify them the way I was creating chords here, licks here, and make up your own phrases and then show them to me. Anyway, I gave you quite a lot of material, and I repeat, if you're a beginner, it's not likely that you can absorb all this in a week. You have to take your time with this. Maybe, it's like 1 month, 2 months, maybe even 3 months. Hey, who knows, maybe even 6 months worth of material that I showed you here. And hopefully you like this approach. Well, these different approaches, you can choose to mix and match however you want, or just focus on one. You have to decide for yourself, because you know how you learn best. Or maybe you can find a teacher who can help you, guide you, a good teacher. I personally really love the language approach, and that's personally how I learned to play. The advantage of this is that you learn a lot about interpretation. You learn to feel the music at a much more subconscious level than thinking about, all right, this is this approach and that. You just hear the sound and you just know it. I guess the disadvantage is if you come strictly from this approach, which I don't. I know a lot of theory actually, but if you come strictly from this approach, then you might not necessarily understand how some of those things work, and therefore might not be able to teach them to other people, if that even matters. There are a lot of musicians who learn this way, a lot of, especially in the gypsy jazz world. It's kind of like people who speak certain languages as their mother tongue. They speak fluently, but they might not be the best people to ask for lessons. They might not even know how to teach their own mother language, or even how certain exact rules work. They just know by instinct what sounds right. No matter what, you will have to put in quite a lot of work, because when it comes to improv, you have to minimize the cerebral thinking and learn to just feel it out. So you have to develop the muscle memory of all the patterns and all that stuff, and then develop the ears to hear lines and reproduce them immediately. Just like when you speak a language, you don't think about grammar, like I'm going to use a pronoun here, then I'm going to use the verb here, and then etc. No, you just speak. Like I said, there are a lot of players out there, especially in the older days, but nowadays in the gypsy community, who have no idea what they're doing. They don't know what a major scale is, they don't know what a 2-5-1 is, but they can play over some of the most difficult bebop tunes because they immerse themselves so much in the language approach that they just know what to play. So I'm saying this not to say that this is the best way, but just keep in mind that this approach actually exists, because a lot of people don't believe it. A lot of teachers will say, oh, you absolutely have to learn theory because there's no other way you can play over these difficult songs. That is not true at all. I know many of these players. Like, I have one player, a friend of mine, who doesn't even know what an E minor chord is. But if you play them this, he'll reproduce it, and not only will he reproduce it, he'll hear many things that he can play over it. And this guy's name is Rocky Gresset, a French gypsy jazz guitar player. Not gypsy jazz, actually he's a gypsy, but he plays gypsy jazz, and bebop. Check them out. Rocky Gresset, Rockygresset. As a final thought, some of these approaches work on certain kinds of tunes, like this one, and I would even put Autumn Leaves in this tier as well. But there are other tunes where we have to employ other approaches, or even disregard some of the ones that I presented here. So that's why I think it's a good idea to learn many different songs, so you go through different, what I call tiers of songs, like different approaches for different songs. And there are not so many different tiers of songs, and once you have these different tiers, you become familiar with them, then almost every song is fairly easy to understand. So for example, like rhythm changes or blues, I would put them in a different tier, and they're in the same category, in my opinion anyway. So for the most part though, in mainstream jazz, the language approach usually works all the time. But in certain modal or vampy tunes where like you have long measures where it's only one chord, or repetitive chordal figures, the language approach might not always work, and then you have a more conceptual approach. There's also rhythmic, motivic approaches. In this video though, I just want to show you, show beginners how to get started in as simple a way as possible. Let me know what you think. It is by no means like a complete guide, because there's so much you can do, but hopefully this is a good way to start for you. I try to make things as easy as possible while still presenting a little bit of a challenge. So good luck.